In a kingdom far, far away, where the rivers ran gold in the light of dawn and the mountains stood like eternal sentinels, a child was born. She was a princess, the first and only daughter of Queen Solène and King Eldrick, and her birth was celebrated as a miracle. For years the royal couple had longed for an heir, their prayers echoing through the grand halls of the castle. When Aurora came into the world, it was as though the gods themselves had smiled upon the kingdom. She was beautiful beyond compare, her golden hair gleaming like the sun, and her laughter bringing joy to all who heard it. The king and queen declared a week of celebration, inviting nobles, villagers, and the fairy council to bless their precious child. The castle sparkled with festivity, its halls filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets. Gifts of jewels and silk piled high in the royal chambers, but none could compare to the blessings bestowed by the fairies. Each fairy approached the cradle, offering their gifts. One gave beauty, so radiant it would make flowers bloom in her presence. Another bestowed a voice, so enchanting it could calm the fiercest storm. Yet another promised wisdom, so profound it would guide her through life's challenges. But one fairy was missing. She was not forgotten by accident, but excluded by design. Maleficent, the dark fairy, was a name spoken only in whispers. Her legend shadowed by fear and her power unmatched. While the other fairies brought light and blessings, Maleficent thrived in shadow, ruling over a desolate moor where nothing bloomed and the air reeked of decay. The king and queen had hoped that by omitting her from the guest list, they could keep her dark influence far from their child. They were wrong. Her arrival was heralded by a thunderclap that shook the castle to its foundations. The candles flickered and died, plunging the grand hall into an eerie darkness. Then came the sound, a steady, deliberate tap, tap, tap of a staff striking the marble floor. Maleficent emerged from the shadows, her presence commanding and dreadful. Her robes, black as midnight, flowed around her like living smoke. Her tall, sharp horns framed a face that was both unnaturally beautiful and terrifyingly cold. High cheekbones and crimson lips gave her an air of regal cruelty, but it was her eyes that chilled the room to its core. Green as poison, they burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce the soul. "Well," she said, her voice low and velvety, yet sharp enough to cut. "What a splendid gathering! How wonderful it must be to celebrate your little miracle while ignoring your kingdom's greatest power." The queen clutched Aurora tighter, her breath hitching. The king stepped forward, sword in hand, but the air itself seemed to press against him, and he froze in place, unable to move. Maleficent smiled, a slow, cruel curve of her lips. She strode toward the cradle, her staff clicking against the floor, each step deliberate and unhurried. The room was silent, but for the faint rustle of her robes, as if even the walls themselves were holding their breath. "What an exquisite child," she murmured, peering down at Aurora. The infant's golden hair glimmered in the faint light. Her tiny fingers curled around nothing. Maleficent's green eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Curiosity, malice, or both. "She deserves a gift," Maleficent purred, straightening. She raised her staff, the gem at its tip glowing with a sickly green light. "A gift as extraordinary as she is." The king shouted, the queen wept, and the fairies pleaded, but Maleficent's voice rose above them all, as cold and final as the toll of a bell. On her 16th birthday, she will prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and fall into a death-like sleep from which she will never awaken. She let the words hang in the air, her smile widening as gasps and cries erupted around her. "Don't fret," she added mockingly. "I've always believed beauty lies in stillness." With a flick of her staff, the shadows surged around her, and in an instant she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of sulfur and the weight of her curse. When the panic subsided, Lillian, the gentlest of the fairies, stepped forward. Her wings quivered as she spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "I cannot undo her curse," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the slumbering child. "But I can give her hope." Lillian raised her wand, a faint light glowing at its tip. "If she is kissed by true love, she will awaken. Her slumber will not be eternal." The king and queen clung to this fragile promise, though their hearts remained heavy with fear. They ordered every spinning wheel in the kingdom destroyed, the fires of the smithies blazing for days as the cursed objects were reduced to ash. To protect Aurora, they made the hardest choice of all. She was taken from the castle and hidden deep within the forest, where she would live in secret under the care of 3 fairies: Lillian, Marigold, and Faye. In the shadowed depths of the forest, Aurora grew. The fairies raised her as their own, hiding her identity and teaching her to live a simple, quiet life. They called her Briar Rose, a name meant to shield her from the curse that loomed over her like a dark cloud. Aurora's days were filled with sunlight and song. She danced through meadows, sang with the birds, and marveled at the beauty of the world around her. But as she grew older, an unease settled in her heart. She dreamed of faces she didn't recognize, of a grand castle and parents she couldn't remember. "Why must we stay here?" she asked Lillian one day, her golden hair catching the light of the sun. "Why can't I see the world beyond the trees?" Lillian hesitated, her gaze full of sadness. "The world is not safe for you, child. One day you will understand." But Aurora longed for more. She yearned for freedom, for the life she felt had been taken from her. On the morning of her 16th birthday, Aurora awoke with a sense of foreboding. The fairies were unusually quiet, their faces clouded with worry. Lillian approached her, taking her hands. "It is time," the fairy said. "We must return to the castle." "The castle?" Aurora asked, confusion and excitement flickering in her eyes. "Yes," Lillian said. "There is much you must know." As they traveled through the forest, Aurora's heart raced with anticipation. She had never seen the castle, yet it felt like home. She didn't notice the way the fairies exchanged nervous glances, or the way their hands trembled as they walked. When they arrived, the castle loomed before them, its spires piercing the sky like dark talons. Aurora felt both awe and unease as she stepped inside, the echoes of her footsteps filling the empty halls. Fate, however, is not so easily escaped. That night, a strange pull led Aurora to an abandoned tower. The air felt thick, and her steps echoed unnaturally as she climbed the winding staircase. At the top, a spinning wheel sat gleaming in the moonlight, its spindle sharp and waiting. "Aurora!" a voice whispered, soft and alluring. She stepped forward, her fingers trembling. The fairy's warnings faded from her mind as if carried away by the wind. She reached out, the tip of her finger brushing the spindle. Pain pricked her skin, and the world shifted. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the cold stone floor. Her eyelids fluttered closed, and the last thing she heard was the sound of distant laughter. As Aurora fell into her enchanted slumber, so too did the rest of the castle. Servants froze mid-step. Knights collapsed at their posts. And even the king and queen fell into a deep sleep, their crowns slipping from their heads. Outside, the forest grew wild and menacing. Thorny brambles crept over the walls, their twisted vines thickening with each passing year. The castle became an impenetrable fortress, forgotten by the outside world. But legends have a way of enduring. Tales of the sleeping princess spread far and wide, whispered in the corners of taverns and around campfires. Many brave souls tried to breach the brambles, but none returned. Until one day, a prince came. He had heard the tales whispered in taverns, rumors of a kingdom cursed and a sleeping princess who awaited her savior. The thorny maze around the castle tore at his armor, drawing blood as he fought his way through. The air grew colder the closer he came, a chill that bit at his resolve. But when he reached the chamber and saw her lying there, he was captivated. His hands trembled as he bent down, the scent of roses lingering faintly in the air. He pressed his lips to hers. Her eyes fluttered open, and the room seemed to exhale. Aurora sat up, her gaze meeting his, and for a moment, it felt as though the world itself had been reborn. The curse was broken. The kingdom would wake, or so they thought. Aurora and the prince were wed within a month, their love blossoming like the roses that now covered the castle in vibrant bloom. The people of the kingdom awoke, their lives picking up as if no time had passed. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants to their stalls, and the castle thrummed with activity once more. Aurora marveled at the world around her, a world she had only glimpsed in her youth. The prince, ever devoted, would take her riding through the hills, showing her the beauty of the land. Laughter echoed through the halls as the young queen embraced her role, her joy infectious. Years passed, and the couple's love deepened. When Aurora gave birth to a daughter, the kingdom celebrated for days. The child, named Daisy, was a beacon of hope, her bright eyes and curious smile reminding the people of the queen they adored. For a time, it seemed the curse had been nothing more than a distant nightmare. The first villager fell asleep on a summer's day. A farmer, in the middle of tending his field, lay down in the soil and did not rise. His family tried everything, water, shouting, even shaking him violently. But he remained still, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of sleep. Weeks later, it happened again. A maid collapsed while cleaning the castle floors. Then a baker in the village square. At first, these incidents were rare. Strange anomalies whispered about in hushed tones. But as the years went on, the sleeping spread like a plague. Villages emptied, their inhabitants succumbing to an endless slumber. Entire cities became ghost towns, their streets eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Aurora watched in horror as her vibrant kingdom withered before her eyes. She and the prince sent envoys far and wide, searching for answers, but no cure could be found. And though they tried to hide it, a terrible thought began to creep into Aurora's mind, a feeling she could not shake. She would stand at her daughter's bedside at night, stroking Daisy's soft curls, and feel a pang of guilt so deep it left her breathless. When she looked into her child's bright eyes, she saw the faces of the villagers, the families who had lost everything. Then came the dreams, They began as faint murmurs in the night. Aurora would wake in a cold sweat, her chest tight and her breath shallow, but the words would fade before she could grasp them. You are awake, but they must sleep. The voice grew louder with each passing night. It was familiar, haunting. Aurora knew it well. The cruel, mocking tone of Maleficent, the dark fairy who had cursed her all those years ago. One night, the dream was different. Aurora found herself standing in the ruined remains of a throne room, its walls blackened with soot and vines creeping across the floor. Maleficent stood before her, cloaked in shadows, her sharp features illuminated by a sickly green light. You thought your curse was broken, the fairy sneered. Oh, my dear, it has only just begun. Aurora's breath hitched. What have you done? Maleficent tilted her head, her smile widening. You are awake, and because of that, they must sleep. That is the curse, my sweet princess. Your life for theirs. It was never about a kiss. It was about balance. As long as you walk this earth, they will slumber. But if you sleep... She trailed off, her smile turning cruel. Aurora woke with a scream, her hands trembling as tears streamed down her face. The terrible truth. Aurora didn't tell the prince immediately. She couldn't. The weight of the truth threatened to crush her. She wandered the castle halls like a ghost, her once bright spirit dimmed by the knowledge of Maleficent's words. Everywhere she looked, she saw reminders of the lives at stake, empty streets, abandoned marketplaces, fields lying fallow. Her dreams continued to torment her. Maleficent's laughter echoed in her mind, and the cursed fairy's words grew clearer each night. Your life for theirs. A kingdom must sleep. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Aurora confided in the prince. They sat in their chambers, the moonlight casting long shadows on the walls. I know why they're falling asleep, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The prince leaned forward, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Aurora hesitated, then told him everything. The dreams, Maleficent's revelation, and the terrible choice she now faced. When she finished, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. No, the prince said at last, his voice firm. It can't be true. Maleficent is a liar, a manipulator. She's trying to torment you. Aurora's eyes filled with tears. And if she's not? Look around us, Philip. Our people are disappearing into slumber. Daisy... Her voice broke. Daisy could be next. The prince's resolve faltered. His hands clenched into fists, and he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. There must be another way, he said hoarsely. Aurora didn't respond. Deep down, she knew there wasn't. Aurora spent her days watching her daughter, memorizing every detail of her bright smile, her laughter, the way a tiny hand fit so perfectly in hers. Daisy was a curious child, always running through the gardens, chasing butterflies, or asking endless questions about the world. Why are so many people asleep, Mama? Daisy asked one evening, her voice tinged with concern. Aurora froze, her heart aching. She knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Sometimes, the world is very tired, she said softly. But it's up to us to make it better. Daisy frowned, her young mind trying to grasp the weight of her mother's words. Will they wake up? Aurora forced a smile. Yes, my love, they will wake. As the months passed, the sleeping plague worsened. Entire towns fell silent, and the castle itself began to feel empty. Aurora knew she couldn't wait any longer. The longer she remained awake, the more lives were lost. One night, as the moon hung heavy in the sky, she went to the prince. He was sitting by the fireplace, his face drawn with exhaustion. When Aurora entered, he looked up, and his expression darkened. "You've made your decision," he said quietly. Aurora nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I have to do this, Philip. For Daisy, for the kingdom." The prince rose, his fists clenched. "There has to be another way, Aurora. I can't lose you again." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his cheek. "You'll still have me," she said, her voice trembling. "In Daisy, in the memories we've made, I'll always be with you." He pulled her into an embrace, his body shaking with silent sobs. "I don't want to say goodbye," he whispered. Aurora closed her eyes, holding him tightly. "You won't have to. This isn't goodbye. This is love." The next morning, Aurora woke early to prepare. She dressed in a simple gown, her golden hair cascading down her back. She looked like the girl who had first fallen into slumber all those years ago. But her eyes carried the weight of a woman who had lived, loved, and lost. She spent the day with Daisy, playing games in the garden and telling her stories. When the sun began to set, she took her daughter in her arms and held her close. "Be brave, my little star," she whispered. "You have a big, beautiful life ahead of you." Daisy looked up at her, sensing something was wrong. "Where are you going, Mama?" Aurora kissed her forehead. "I'm going to help the kingdom, my love. And I need you to take care of Papa for me." The child nodded solemnly, though she didn't fully understand. That night, as the stars blanketed the sky, Aurora ascended the tower. The spindle sat there, untouched for years, its sharp tip glinting in the moonlight. The prince was by her side, his face pale and drawn. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice breaking. Aurora nodded. "This is the only way." She turned to him one last time, their eyes locking. "Promise me you'll tell Daisy how much I love her, how much I love both of you." "I promise," he choked out. With trembling hands, Aurora pricked her finger on the spindle. As Aurora's body crumpled to the floor, her face serene in slumber, a ripple of magic spread across the land. Villages stirred to life, farmers and bakers and maids awakening with confused murmurs. The kingdom was alive once more, their queen's sacrifice lifting the curse. In the tower, the prince knelt beside Aurora, his tears falling onto her lifeless form. The weight of her loss pressed down on him, but in his grief, he clung to her final words. "This isn't goodbye, this is love." He carried her to the royal crypt, where she was laid to rest in a bed of roses. Her tomb became a place of pilgrimage, her story passed down through generations as a tale of sacrifice and love. Years later, as Daisy grew into a young woman, she often visited her mother's tomb. One night, as she stood there in the moonlight, she heard a faint whisper. "Daisy?" She spun around, her heart pounding. The shadows seemed to move, coalescing into a faint, familiar figure. It was Maleficent. "You thought it was over?" the dark fairy hissed, her smile wicked. "Curses have a way of lingering, my dear. Sleep may bring peace, but it is never eternal." Daisy froze, her breath caught in her throat. Behind her, the spindle glinted faintly in the darkness. Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.